Well, good afternoon. This is the highly coveted Friday afternoon 4 p.m. time slot. And the herd has been thinned a little bit. In fact, I do know there's another bio-feedstock processing plant at the end of the dock. They have yeast, barley, hops. I think some of our session has moved right on over. Hey, first of all, my name's Lauren Chambers. I'm the General Manager of Chevron's Fuels and Lubricants business here in Australia. You would be more familiar with it as Caltex. And Chevron's really pleased to be sponsoring this important discussion about how we unlock renewable fuels here in WA. A little bit of background on myself. You can tell I don't have an Australian accent, but it's not an American one, it's a Canadian one, proudly. I've got 30 years in the industry. Half of my time was in Canada, working for Chevron, then into the US, in the last 2 years in Australia, which my wife and I just absolutely love. So I'm trying to avoid any US area code phone calls. I do not want to go back. The last couple of roles that I had with Chevron I think are important, and I was asked to provide a little bit of a commentary on Chevron's global experience in renewable fuels. 2 roles ago, I was heading up our retail business in the United States. The last role, I was heading up Chevron's global external affairs, government affairs organization. So spent a lot of time in places like Sacramento, a lot of time in Washington, D.C., and wouldn't it be interesting to be there this month? But through that lens, maybe I could offer some comments and some of our experiences and insights to kick this section off in terms of renewable fuels. Fair enough? Okay, good. I was told to be patient, that it does actually shift. There we go. Okay, when you pay and sponsor a section, you do get to talk about your own company for just a little bit. So I promise to be quick on this. Chevron has a long and proud history in Australia, over 70 years. And in fact, we're a big investor. $60 billion were invested in our LNG facility here in WA on Australian goods and services in constructing it. So big foreign investor. We're also a massive employer, 4,600 direct jobs on the upstream production side of the business and in the fuels and lubricants business in Australia. Also, a big part of the economy. Third-party independent assessments have estimated our impact to GDP over the life of our LNG asset in WA at about close to $700 billion. And within that, about $240 billion paid in taxes over the life of the asset, which is about a 35-year life asset. Big energy producer, and that's been mentioned a few times today. That facility in WA, Gorgon Wheatstone, produces enough LNG to power 50 million homes in Australia and across the Asia-Pacific region. And I think probably even more important that gas, that liquefied natural gas, is actually substituting coal for electricity generation through most of Asia-Pacific, and that saves 75 million tons a year of carbon emissions. So this is actively part of our energy transition to lower carbon sources as we go into the future. I know it's going to work. There we go. We have a large carbon capture facility at Gorgon Wheatstone, over 10 million tons captured to date. And then I mentioned Caltex Fuels and Lubricants. That's about 360 branded stations across Australia and also supplying into the commercial industrial sector, over 3 billion liters a year and climbing. Okay, another fun fact. So Caltex was proudly, and this is one of Chevron's preeminent sponsorships of distinction in the world. We've had 2 years association with the Brisbane Lions. I've become a footy fan, you can tell. My corporate affairs advisor said, don't put that up there. This is a renewable fuels discussion. Come on, it's footy. So the Brisbane Lions won this little game 2 weeks ago that I think has become a pretty big deal in Australia, and a premiership with the Caltex logo proudly on the Guernsey. So again, a sponsorship of distinction, 2 years, both in the grand final and a premiership on one. We also have a sponsorship on the West Coast, and it's also a sponsorship of distinction with the Eagles. It's the highest cost sponsorship per win that we have on the globe. I kid you not. So of distinction, how about that? Walking into WA and taking a shot at the Eagles. This dumb Canadian doesn't know any better. Okay. We're not here to talk about footy, though I'd love to. We're here to talk about renewable fuels. So Chevron does participate across a broad spectrum of renewable fuels. We do business in 180 countries across the planet. And in fact, we've made an external commitment to produce by the year 2030, 100,000 barrels per day of liquid renewable fuels. That's 6 billion liters per year. And we are well over halfway to achieving that today. Just a little bit of a cross-section of photos that I could touch on a few things in terms of our experience. And again, this represents commercial scale, some emerging scale, and then there's also what I would call test pilot or demonstration scale. On the top left, you can see that's one of our advertising copies from the US. We have renewable fuels, a lot of it driven by policy, particularly in California, but certainly Washington, Oregon, Texas, to incentivize a production and investment of renewable diesel at scale, and we do have that in place across most of our branded facilities. The top right photo is the logo of the Renewable Energy Group. That's one of the largest feedstock aggregators and biodiesel and renewable diesel producers in the world. 2 years ago, Chevron acquired that company. It's based in Iowa. And that put us up on the capability scale in terms of being able to source feedstocks, an important investment for us, a $3 billion investment. On the bottom left corner is a picture of a Toyota, and you can see that there's a Chevron logo on it. We have a strategic alliance with Toyota, and this one is a demonstration project, and it's about producing renewable gasoline. We've talked a lot about diesel today, but renewable gasoline, when you consider, and this is the US, and I'll draw the parallel in Australia, there are 275 million internal combustion engine vehicles on the road today in the US, and 90% of the new vehicles purchased are still internal combustion engines. And we need lower carbon solutions now for those vehicles. In fact, the average vehicle off the assembly line lasts 12 to 15 years. So we have a long runway ahead of us with needing to find solutions for gasoline as well. And we entered this demonstration project with Toyota, and we are producing renewable gasoline that reduces carbon intensity by 40%. So it is significant, and I think we need to, in all solutions, think about the time value of carbon emissions, kind of like net present value of cash. Reducing a unit of carbon today is more valuable to the planet than one in 50 years. In the middle photo is a picture of one of our marketers, highway transport trucks, and it's actually fueling up renewable natural gas. Never thought I'd say this with 30 years in the industry, but we are dairy farmers. And not literally, but we have investments in dairy farms in California. Again, policy provided the incentives for investment, whereby we capture methane from the dairy livestock. Now, I will leave your imagination to fill in just what that livestock is. But when people say, Chambers, you're full of crap, I take that as a compliment. We have an adequate feedstock to produce renewable natural gas. So that's a little bit about what policy can do to lower emissions in our industry. So you can see quite a cross-section of products that we're in. So why renewable fuels? And I'm going to put all of these up on the screen because we've talked about them today. And so I'm not going to go through them one by one, but I do want to pause on one of them. There we go. The one in the middle, the diversity of energy solutions. Today on the planet, unbelievably, we have a fairly diversified set of energy solutions that power the globe. And in fact, for a moment, sadly, let's just pause and reflect that there are two major conflicts going on the planet. One Russia, Ukraine, one in the Middle East. Both big energy producing regions. Yet the price of oil is around $75 a barrel. If those same conditions had been in place 15 to 20 years ago, I have no doubt the price of crude oil would be over $200 a barrel. And it's because we've allowed technology to unleash energy geographically. There's emerging renewable solutions, and we have legacy fossil fuel production with a need to drive down the carbon intensity of producing those products. That's an important consideration that we've learned from the past, but going forward, diversity and energy security is a real important aspect to consider. Renewable fuels does provide that. If we over-index on any one transportation solution, such as electric vehicles, there will be unintended consequences. We need a diversified set of energy solutions. And I think that's an important consideration as we go forward. And I did hear it commented on a few times. Okay. So this one, I think, would be worth a little bit of commentary based on Chevron's experience. Again, across a broad spectrum of jurisdictions, and we've been at this for some time, and then I've had some personal experience in terms of the policy frameworks. First and foremost, and it's going to be in pretty small font, it's important to consider total life cycle emissions. I did hear that spoken a couple of times, but that's critical. You need to look at every component of the value chain and what it takes to bring any product to market. Absolutely critical in forming any policy. Certainly, we bias towards market-based mechanisms. And in my mind, this is all about creating that economic incentive to provide a fairly stable investment climate, so investment dollars flow to renewable fuels, but also such that the most effective and lowest cost carbon reduction solutions are allowed to rise to the top and be rewarded. That ensures reliable and the lowest, most efficient cost to society as a whole. So we think that's really important, and we've seen that in various markets like California, where it is market-based. It's not perfect, but it's market-based, and we've seen the investment dollars flow into the state. Hand in hand with that is technology neutral. We really try to dissuade policymakers from pre-selecting winning and losing technologies. Let innovation and let economic justification drive that forward. And the human spirit across the planet has a legacy of providing solutions if there's an economic incentive, and we feel to stifle that would be not wise. So a level playing field to allow all potential solutions to compete. And as I mentioned, the concept of present value of carbon reduction is important. Time matters. It's one thing to think 50 years from now or 2050 net zero. That is critical, but don't forget today's carbon reduction. That's just as critical. Okay. I think this is probably the most important slide based on our experience, and I think it's a perfect segue for me to hand off to James to facilitate our closing discussion. And there's a bit of an ecosystem here, and I can say from personal experience in California over many years, it took producers, policymakers, engine manufacturers, end consumers, the community at large to participate in what policy should look like. No one group can do it alone. In fact, if one group does try and do it alone, I guarantee it'll be a less than optimal decision and set of conditions to have renewable fuels grow. So that one I feel really strongly about. It's a testament that we're in the room, because that is that ecosystem in action. So again, thanks for allowing me to take a few moments to kick us off. And again, Chevron was proud and happy to be a sponsor of this important discussion. So thanks very much, and over to you, James.
So what we're hoping to be able to collect from this is to provide some information to the WA government, to the federal government, about some of the collective views across the value chain. So some of you were subject to this torture yesterday. Some of you have been subject to this torture for previous workshops. Please play along.
It's all helping, promise.
It's all helping, and what it really does is it can provide government with a really strong view of the consistency, but also points of divergence between different groups of stakeholders. So in the piece we just saw before, you know, feedstock providers, fuel suppliers, fuel users, engine manufacturers, everyone has their own role to play in this value chain. Everyone has their own perspectives on what's feasible, what's important, what needs to happen. And so that, my friends, is what we are about to take a whistle-stop tour of. Maybe.
I think be patient was the...
Not a virtue I possess. Maybe we just do this the old-fashioned way. Are you guys able to tab across? Oh, we've jumped well ahead. Okay, cool. Okay, so this was the test to see if people could actually fill in a form. And lo and behold, you in fact know where you're from. Very helpful.
That's good. There's 75 people on there. That's fantastic.
Yeah, no, it's
76?
a good sample. Yeah, and you know, a few on the user side, a few on the supplier side, a few on the feedstock side, right? So enough to have, let's not call it a statistically significant sample, but a reasonable enough sample based on who's in the room. And so what we wanted to do was just ask some very basic questions. You've seen them. Why are we doing this, right? What are the different drivers for the different businesses? And everyone is very much favouring decarbonisation. We're doing this for the planet. Very good, very helpful. Interestingly enough, you know, other objectives around revenue growth, still important. Clearly not as big a driver as some other things. And the innovation that comes with this, clearly quite important. So very interesting, very helpful.
Just noticed sorry, just back there. I just noticed a few voices are missing. Are there other drivers that aren't on there that people think should be included? Or did that largely cover it? No?
Rip
Sorry,
in,
yeah.
rip in.
Reducing agricultural emissions to create carbon neutral.
Does that count as decarbonisation?
Well, yeah, decarbonisation, ag sector as well as other sectors, yeah, at 100%.
Well, regional development.
Yep,
Yeah,
that's fair.
fair.
Yeah.
Jobs and growth always helps.
For sure.
Okay, so in this one we wanted to really understand what the opportunity set is for WA. What's most important? Is it, you know, the ability to build a domestic supply industry and supply that to users in the state, export it to other states? Is it continuation of the current model where it's feedstock led? And there are, you know, pretty material returns to that at the moment. Very interesting that, you know, the perspective seems to be quite strongly domestic supply for domestic use. And so the question that I might have is that where this industry starts? Or do we think that the initial production, the initial few litres will be exported? Or do we think that the demand is there sufficiently already such that, you know, if the first project gets up, so if Pauline and BP, you know, manage to get their project off the ground in the next couple of years, is that going straight to domestic supply or is that being exported? What are our views?
My impression of the day and the other discussions that have been had is that there's lots of people here in Australia that want to buy renewable fuels if they're available. There's lots of feedstock to produce the fuels. There's lots of technologies available to convert the feedstock into the fuels. The gap that seems to be missing is we just can't do it at the price that it works to everyone. So I think that's, you know, the challenge. I think everyone is willing, and I think there's a big enough supply and demand here within Australia. That's how I see it. Yep.
Terrific. Oh, sorry.
One of the things I want to highlight is that the focus in West Australia and the mining industry, the pathway that's being proposed that would be established in Western Australia is the heifer pathway. It predominantly wants to make diesel. They have to muck around and they don't really like to make jet, and it's only make jet because it's sexy and diesel isn't. So straight away the pathway that's been chosen for the region wants to make diesel, hence why mining industry is the no-brainer.
Yeah, so I think the question on whether it's going to be exported or used domestically actually fundamentally comes down to whether you leave it to market forces or whether there's, you know, domestic reservation like we have with gas, you know, in Western Australia, for example. So where is the best net back for the producer? And so if it's left completely to market forces, then that might mean exporting it overseas if there is a better net back for the producer. So I think there's opinion or a desire to have it domestically, but if you're a prudent producer and you're not mandated to keep those molecules in the country, then you will sell it to whoever pays the most.
I can just speak loudly, don't I? I suppose one other thing is, particularly with some of the government incentives, take for example the HPTI, one thing that's coming under more scrutiny is where you set your boundary limits, and one of that is that it's actually at the consumer, which begs the question, say you're making green or blue or whatever shade of ammonia, if you're sending it off to Korea, Japan, then that does get counted for transporting your emissions, and therefore that does start to also frame some of the incentives and
All right, we might move on.
Is there something, I guess, this is WA specific. We're looking, this question has been asked for WA. Presumably we're saying that that mining in particular, supply to the rest of Australia, are the sort of the biggest priorities for WA because it is a no-brainer. Is that what we're saying?
For me, what was missing on there was a couple of other options, including agriculture. It's been spoken about. Yeah, agriculture is a big user and under a lot of pressure to decarbonise because of the direct link of food going to consumers who want green labels on their food. So, a lot of Australia's food goes through the major supermarkets who've got commitments to decarbonise and are putting a lot of pressure on farmers to do that. So, if you'd had agriculture up there, I think that for WA, that would also be really high.
Watch this. If it loads, I promise, there is in fact a question about demand. But ag's still missing. Very sad.
Well, it's an interesting one, isn't it, in terms of, and I guess this is the challenge for the WA government and perhaps for federal as well, in terms of this incredible opportunity that a lot of sectors can benefit from, but the policy settings and how they're framed will determine who gets the benefit, presumably, of that. And so balancing that off is going to be quite a challenge. Yeah.
I think what we've heard as well is that, there's very strong demand, particularly in WA, from mining. We've heard from our friends in aviation that there's, a fair chunk of demand there. I guess we've heard big aggregate numbers of sort of what current fuel use is. My question back to some of the users is, what do you think you will be consuming in 2035? Is it, a target of 10 or 20, 25% of your fuel base? Obviously, that's going to depend somewhat on price. But, do you think that the demand by 2035 will be enough to underwrite one project? Will it be 2 refineries, 3 refineries? Very interested to hear people's views on scale of demand.
Like I said before, it's actually really hard for individual consumers to say how much will I be using if they don't know what the policy context is. So, it's like, well, if there is some kind of regulated demand for Australia and Australians have to reduce the emissions from the fuel that they use, and there's a target like there is in California, then that's the answer, right, for the fuel users. It's quite hard for them to be saying what, like as an individual user, I think it's quite hard to say in 2035 what they would be willing to use if they don't know what the incentives are for the use of that fuel.
But are we not seeing organisations come out with targets and pathways that sort of says, based on what they know of these technology pathways, they expect X% to be met by this? We are seeing that from various corporates. So they do have some idea of what their target is. Presumably that will shift, in terms of what they actually, do, will depend on price, et cetera, But I guess there's aspirational targets that consumers are establishing, which, I guess is what we're trying to say is, based on those aspirational targets and what we know, what does it mean that we'll be seeing by 2035 if government policy backs it in? Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, so something that Pauline and I talk about at BP and is this idea of hard to abate versus expensive to abate. If we look at, drop-in liquid fuels, a lot of the technology pathways are actually relatively mature, and it's just a function of it being too expensive to adopt. And so, Rio Tinto would completely transition all of its diesel to renewable diesel if it was the same price as conventional fossil. Yeah. So I think some of those targets are really just a function of, in an ideal world, knowing that the technology that we have, we would, transition this much fuel. But because the price is so far off parity, it just becomes so challenging. So I think there's an opportunity there to obviously work on bridging that, but by having regulated demand, then it will create that level playing field for companies to, not feel like they're self-sabotaging or self-harming by going down a pathway where they, destroy part of their revenue base or their cost base by adopting something more expensive than what they have access to now.
So say we're in a universe of regulated demand. Obviously, that's got to be paid for somewhere. Again, let's just pretend we're in 2035, 10 years from now. What level of regulated demand do we think needs to be there? Is it 5%? Is it 10? Like, I'm going to be a pain in the ass about getting to a number. So have you got a sense, from, BP's view, other views about what is practical and what that regulated demand target might look like?
Rather than say exactly what we think the ambition should be, I guess what we can tell you is we can have a look at the kinds of volumes you might get from something like Kwinana, and others have got investment cases that they're exploring as well. Like LanzaJet can tell you what their volume might be, and we can get quite a long way in terms of investments and learning and get the industry going with quite modest regulated demand over the period to say 2030. So we've got say sort of 500 million litres, and that would, I understand, what's that, about 7% or something of the domestic jet fuel. So that, if you were doing international jet fuel as well, it would be less, and if you were doing some HVO and some jet, you can kind of get a sense of the scale, and you can get, if you wanted to get, 2 or 3 or 4 investments off the ground, it wouldn't be a very, we're not talking about having to go to 50% in 2035. Hopefully that helps a bit more.
James, can I add to that?
Do you want to give your perspective?
So I think you can look to what other countries are doing, starting off pretty modest in early years, 1-2% here and there, and then 2030 we're at 5-10%. I think it's part of the role of government too to model that and look what's going to be right sized for Australia given what we have in the pipeline. And to Pauline's point, I mean, starting out modest, your first few investments are probably going to be enough to meet that, but then you need to increase that ambition to ensure that you've got other projects and new technologies coming in behind it.
Probably not the answer you're looking for, James, but I kind of go back to the comments over here. It depends on the cost, because we have to look at the MAC curve. Diesel's 12 to 14% of our MAC curve. Is the next best thing on our MAC curve to carbon abate it the most efficient way to put more biofuels in 2033, 2034, 2035? It depends on the cost of them. So right now, the next best thing for us to do was to do it in boron because of cost parity. The thing after that to do was nothing to do with diesel. It was in the other areas of our decarbonisation journey. So it depends. Sorry.
It always does. Who knew? Markets ran on price.
Sorry, and just an additional thought, and I think consistent with some of the things we've seen with Future Made in Australia. With oil refining, Australia's become very uncompetitive, and that's why we only have 2 fossil oil refineries in Australia now. And so, in a globally traded market, distillate is very liquid. Biorefining creates an opportunity for Australia to bring back some, liquid fuel sovereignty, and we have some natural advantages in doing that. One is, the agri piece and the feedstock piece, which we've spoken about today, and so the opportunity is not just around, carbon intensity and meeting some of those decarbonisation roadmaps for those corporates, but also bringing back some fuel sovereignty, and these biofuel products, renewable diesel or SPK, are not going to be liquidly traded for a very, very long time. Maybe they never will be if they're not made in abundance. And so this creates an opportunity for Australia to, have a sovereign liquid fuel manufacturing sector, which can only be a good thing, in the context of geopolitics, but also for our own NDC and all the things that we want to achieve in this country. We are very hungry for liquid fuels given the scale of our country, and like the hard to abate conversation, but also very hard, where it's also hard to electrify Australia as well. So I think it's a very important part of the puzzle.
Completely agree. So we've heard a lot, just before we jump in, from a couple of key sectors. I guess one question that I have in my mind is, for some of those other sectors, so for ag, for construction and transport, for construction, for some of the on-site power, our friend from Horizon Power there, is there a need for any kind of demand aggregation, or is the feeling that the demand is out there, it's just a question of price? Is there any other friction on the demand side that needs to be resolved, or is it just a price question? We're looking for some views from some of our other sectors.
Thank you. So a couple of things. One is, I think, on the demand side for agriculture, there's certainly that issue that was highlighted in the construction sector of the OEM, certification of use of these fuels in things. So people obviously spend millions of dollars on headers and tractors and things like that, and they've got to be sure that their warranties and things will still work. So I think there's, and that's not something that those customers are at the scale that they can tackle individually. So whereas a mining company or an oil company can do that, no, ag can't. So I think that's a role for at least let's say a government facilitated certification scheme or something like that.
Or just even seeing pilots, like a bit like the construction pilot, being able to sort of see those.
Pilot's not enough. They can't just see it and hear it. They've got to just know from the supplier, like John Deere's got to say, yes, it's okay, you can use that fuel. That fuel is certified for use in John Deere's tractors. Okay. That's what's needed. And just to say the other thing is, I think also, just because of the actors in the room, a lot of the focus and discussion here has been about large-scale production of liquid biofuels. And if we're talking about agriculture, regional development, feedstock dispersion, I think there's a big role to play for the smaller scale, modular, regional located biofuels, and that shouldn't be missed in the policy section as well, that there should be incentivisation for that as well.
That's good. Angela, you were chipping in?
Price parity sounds great, doesn't it? It would make everybody's life really easy. But isn't the question price parity factoring carbon? Because, most of the big users are already factoring a carbon price that's fairly high. So the solution is price parity factoring carbon. So the price might not be the same at the fuel pump, but when you factor in the gains that we're making in reducing carbon, the gains that we could be making in all the green initiatives. So price parity is great, but maybe it's price parity less carbon and other factors that we'd like to consider in the future of our country.
Every little bit helps.
Every little bit helps.
I just want to, Dave Evans, DSCG, I just want to go back to the OEM comments. I've been dealing in this space for about 14 years. So I've been doing it a long time. I've been dealing with the US Navy qualification programs of, let me say, HVO. For us, it's HEFA. We call it synthetic paraffinic diesel. Fischer-Tropsch's the same thing, and we've done SIP, which is just in aviation. We're doing alcohol to diesel. We've done CHCJ, which is other. And one of the problems that we have, and this is a big thing in the diesel, in aviation, it's all connected. Yeah, OEMs are intimately involved in the certification program and in the specifications. There's only two global specifications, AS91 1655 and DESTAN 9191. And the OEMs are intimately involved. In the diesel world, you've got EN 590 European, you've got D975 US, and there's a significant disconnect. Then you get in the maritime space, you've got ISO 8217, a total disconnect again. So that because of that, disconnection in the specifications, a lack of OEM direct involvement and harmonisation, there's a lot of barriers to get through. Even us going through, defence trying to do demonstrations right now, and we're not demonstrating that the fuel works, we're demonstrating that the supply chain can deliver, nothing else, because we know that we operated ships at 50% at sea back in 2014, so nothing new for us. And the hardest thing is going to an OEM such as Caterpillar and going asking for approval, and they say no, even though they go, yeah, it's, and you see their handbook and say, yep, you can use anything that's blended that looks like an N590, but when you actually ask them, they go, what are you using? And you're saying a blended HVO, and the panic, and the US OEM going yes, and the Australian OEM reps going no. And we've seen that across many things, and I don't know as a collective how we address it. You can address it a little bit during the development of your specifications, which I know DQ are doing, and I know they worked a lot with the vehicle OEMs in getting that going up for essentially either neat HVO or a blended product. And I know they've been having that discussion, and I think some of the things for the ag industry is examples of the pilots where they're using neat HVO are lovely, but they might not be domestically true even for defence. Defence will only do up a 50% blend limit because we have concerns around aromatic seal swirl leaking, and not on our engines, but on our ship manifolds and our other infrastructure that support the refuelling activities. And I think ag will have the same thing. So I think one of the things that Defence needs to do, and I don't want to line them up because I kind of, as a scientist, I can kind of throw them under the bus and frank and fearless advice, is one of the things I think industry needs is Defence to step up. And we've got a lot of lessons learned, a lot of experience, and we probably need to, as a Five Eyes collective, get it out there exactly what we've been doing and where we're going, so industry doesn't have to repeat our same mistakes.
That's great. Policy, state, I think.
Maybe.
We just need to keep moving.
Okay, so just very quickly, we've covered this. We've covered it fairly extensively. Cost premiums, policy certainty, availability, some reg barriers, OEMs, a whole lot of different challenges here. But the interesting one is a lot of this conversation has revolved around things the federal government can do, or the things that the federal government is really well placed to do. The federal government's doing quite a lot in the space already. State governments have got a clear role. We had a question earlier on it. We did want to test with you, which level of government you all collectively thought was more or less responsible for different things, right? So it's very interesting that you see, on the demand side, on sort of rules and regulations of the market, very clearly something that's, got a large federal government slant, thank God. Whereas things on the feedstock side, things on project facilitation, feels very much like a role for the state government. Hopefully, our colleagues from WA government, that is a useful confirming data point. You can go to take over the federal government. Go for it. You've done it with GST. We'll get there. Okay, this is the one that we're really keen to rip into. So, obviously, WA is facing a particularly interesting year next year with an election. There are, some might say windows of opportunity popping up both federally and at state level for policy initiatives to slip through the cracks. And so we wanted to understand, based on people's understanding of the respective roles of state and federal government, what should the WA government be trying to do for next year? So we've got some comments up there, some that are interesting.
Also not that many responses. So I think it would be great to get more. If, WA government are really asking for your assistance here in terms of the prioritisation of what they should be focused on and what they put forward as their key initiatives. So if we can get some more input into that, that would be really, really helpful.
And also just keen for people to start ripping in. What would you like the WA government to do? They're sitting just here.
Well, representatives of the WA government. Yes.
There's just one thing that we would like to see in particular is an expression of a strategy going forward. That sort of, I know that gets difficult, but I think it's a strategy to not have to sort of say, yes, I believe in it 100%, just an expression of support in that form would be fantastic for prospective feedstock producers in WA.
So something that brings together the policy package and sets out the vision and the way to get there.
Yep.
Who knew? It's interesting. So we've heard a lot about things government needs to do, and the minute we get specific, we get really quiet.
I don't think WA has a roadmap for low carbon liquid fuels.
Yeah, because I mean, yeah, that's helped the hydrogen world tremendously here in Australia, and maybe that expression of a strategy would be better expressed as a roadmap to start with.
I think various states have a roadmap. WA doesn't, but there's an aspiration for one, I believe. Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, one thing the WA government can do is have a think about offtake. So they have a lot of liquid fuel use in their own operations. They have stated emission reduction targets for government for government business. So one thing they could do is have a conversation with us about offtake. So,
yes, I'm sure they'd love to. So they've got maritime, they've got vehicles, they've got all sorts. Yep. Sorry, there's a mic. Just a gentleman behind you.
Yep. I'd like to see a WA target for a specific volume produced here in WA.
Production target,
and
yep.
that's supported by some funding, competitive funding for projects to meet that target.
And I think just to add a little bit of clarity to it, so a target, multiple facilities, some big, some small?
Yeah.
Mix
A target
of technologies?
of leaders. Look, the typical WA that it'll be done. Some of it has to be in the regions, some of it has to be north, some of it has to be south, some of it has to be left and right and black and white. But yeah, a target would be good.
So Dave Edwards from Horizon Power. As many of you will know, we're the regional power provider. We use about 20 million litres of diesel a year, and fortunately that's going down because of renewable energy penetration in microgrids is going up. But we've put 2 expressions of interest out to industry over the last couple of years, really keenly interested in biofuel supply, and we've had lacklustre replies. So if anybody in the room we've actually been able to make contact with some great people today, but we'd be keenly interested in reliable, demonstrably reliable supply that we can ship out to the regions. And also if there's anybody that's interested in mining in some kind of strategic partnership to cover the distances and the quantities, maybe there's the value in us working together.
One area that falls firmly under the state government is planning, and I suppose land use there. And I suppose from Technique's point of view, Genesis, some of the projects we've looked at, and probably what we've seen a lot highlighted today, is there's a bit of a trade-off between you might be growing trees or this logistics side, and then people want to get the capex down and where do you build your plant. Without going into all the detail, this does create a little bit of a nuance for the state where they might say, okay, we want to set up strategic industrial areas in communities that might be remote, that might have good access to renewables or whatever it might be that is sort of doing this in that space, and sort of starting to think about that land use planning here, particularly when we look at some of the initiatives out there that are looking at massive swathes of land and how that might affect the zoning for it. So that would be it.
That makes sense. I mean, we heard a bit about that at the roundtable yesterday, that notion of sort of clustering and really picking some sort of sweet spots and really starting to build sort of nice, sort of complex ecosystems for industry, which, is something very much within the realm of WA government, presumably. Anything for the feedstock or ag sort of side of this that you'd like to... Yeah.
Sorry, I would want to refer to James's analysis earlier when you spoke, and you highlighted a number of key issues about collaboration, about coordination of feedstocks, about and that sort of does reach beyond what farmers and farmer groups can do. And I think you highlighted some very important issues there. And so I think some help with that kind of aggregation would be fantastic in terms of just identifying. We also have a a policy for the distribution of electricity in WA, which really just makes it the same price wherever you are. And there's quite a large subsidy that goes towards making that happen. And I've always thought that maybe that subsidy might be better used to support initiatives at the regional level, which involve not just, and this would possibly involve liquid fuels in terms of generation, but in other activities where electricity is actually being subsidised, and there might be better ways of doing it. So there are, just some hurdles which need to be identified, which alter the market, if you like. And I think some of those, I've just chosen a couple.
I tried that in Queensland. I wanted my hands on that money from the Queensland government has the same subsidy. And it seemed to me, if you managed to pull forward a couple of years of that, you could do so many things. They never really do that.
I think aggregation is a really interesting word in the context of this, because I think every individual company has quite a constrained view on what they're looking at. Like we in aviation look relatively strictly at what we can do. Blinkers on, trying to focus on SAF production. We've got people here from a lot of different industries. We don't talk a lot together. I think aggregating those views and setting out the way that each industry should interact is probably the key role for government. James's hybrid Sankey diagram was a fantastic representation of the degree of interaction that you cannot deal with as an individual company, whereas that's the sort of thing that government can facilitate. I think the other thing really is aggregation of demand, and there are some really interesting sort of buyer of last resort policies and things like that that have driven projects, basically just brought forward decision point of projects. There's lots of little clusters of demand across aviation, across diesel in multiple different uses. Having a government come in as a buyer of last resort on a couple of different projects to facilitate them going forward and then divvying up the production on the back end might work.
Look, we're getting pretty close to time, a couple more, but I'm just wondering, WA government, is there anything else you need from this group before we wrap? Yep. Angela.
Look, just a quick view from a project developer's point of view. Look, there's some big projects, and making biofuels does lend itself to economies of scale, there's no question. But in Western Australia, we have a huge land mass. And we've seen today talk about how widely bioresources could be distributed. So that potentially means lots of smaller projects. Now, if you're a project developer and you've got a project of $50 million or $100 million, you don't even get on the radar here. So project approvals is going to be critical, especially as the projects get smaller and smaller and regional. We've tried many times to put forward our projects, and because of the scale, even a $300 million project, it's hard to get on the radar, never mind when we get to $10 million projects, facilitating all this regional biomass collection and project development. The projects are going to get smaller, they're going to get lots of them. There's no way that the government right now can actually handle even the big projects that are on the radar. So approvals, especially in this area, are going to be critical to moving an industry forward.
Perfect. Look, we might end on that note, and certainly innovation in the planning sector very much required. Flynn, you are doing closing remarks, I believe, but thank you everyone for your participation. It's fantastic.
Thank you, Georgine and James. It's very late on a Friday, so well done to making it to 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. Everything, the presentations, recordings, everything that was captured today is going to be sent out, I believe, or available on the website. YouTube channel, there you go. So a quick thank you to our sponsors today, the Western Australian Department of Primary Industries, Chevron, Cargill and GrainCorp. US Grains Council, I should say. GrainCorp, Cargill sponsored last night. Thank you to our presenters today, our facilitators, and thank you to all of you for your attendance and support of today's event.